I love all of those colorful, beautiful berries that you see at this time of year. The amazingly colored purple beautyberry, the plump, juicy rose hips, and the subtle white snowberries hinting at winter frosts ahead. These were the inspirations for the piece that I'm going to work on today. And for the first layer, I'm going to warm up by adding some autumn leaves. And I'm going to make life simple for myself and just use the most basic leaf shape. I've got this lovely orange cloth that I think will show up nicely against the yellow background, and I cut out a leaf shape. Got some gold color thread, and I'm just going to sew it down. I'll start out by sewing down the middle of the leaf. No reason, just what I feel like doing. This really is a warm-up for later stitching and a place to experiment and try things out. If I don't like the way something works, I could definitely plan to cover that part up. So there's my first leaf. And now I've got this leaf printed cloth, so I'm going to make a few more leaves, and you'll notice that I didn't cut out all leaves at the beginning and plan out where they're going to go. I'm just cutting out one at a time. Well, in this case, two, because when I cut out the first leaf, there was an extra piece of cloth that created a second leaf. I'm just working on one leaf at a time, deciding where to put that, and then making my next decision, trusting that everything will work out as it should. I don't need to know what the end is going to look like to take the next step. And now I've got several leaves scattered around the outside edges of my piece, and I think it's time to move on to some berries. I'm going to start out with the largest of the berries. Well, rose hips, maybe they're not technically berries, but that's where I'm starting. When I was out for a walk one day, I saw these really beautiful kind of football-shaped rose hips. But I'm going to make my rose hips sort of a teardrop shape, and they seem to grow in clusters. And I've got this really horrible synthetic red fabric, but I'm going to use it. It's the right color, it'll work. And for some reason I have a lot of it at home, so it's good to find a way to use it. So I've cut out the first berry, and I've got some darker red thread. It doesn't match exactly, but perhaps it'll lend some shadows to my piece here. And again, I will just sew around the edge of this piece to secure it onto the background cloth. And then I'll cut out another berry. And again, I'm not planning the whole thing from the beginning, and I'm not using any templates because, just as in nature, each of these berries is going to be slightly different. And if I had traced around the shape, they would end up being the same. So they're simple shapes. I don't think it's necessary to always have a line to trace. I think most people are quite capable of cutting out simple shapes like this without having a pattern, but I think that sometimes we become so used to somebody else telling us what something should look like that we forget to trust our own instincts. And now often rose hips have little scraggly bits on the end. So I'm going to add those on using simple chain stitches, really messy chain stitches, and fly stitches, just to give the suggestion of those little tufts at the end in a brownish color. And since I still had some thread left on my needle, I added a bit of a branch there. And now I'm going to move on to the medium-sized berries, the snowberries, little white berries that grow in these vertical clusters. I can draw them out as individual berries like this, or I can draw a blobby shape and then draw the little circles on top to suggest individual berries. And I think the way that I'm going to approach this is to cut out a blob shape and then use my stitches to suggest the individual berries. And the stitch that I'm going to use for this is something called a buttonhole wheel or a blanket stitch wheel, which is a regular blanket stitch, a looped stitch, but instead of working it in a straight line, you go around in a circle. And I'm using a pale pink thread for this. I don't want it to be really bold. I just want there to be a slight suggestion that there are some circles going on here. And there you can see how much I fumble around with my thread getting caught up on things. So the way that it works is you come up where you want the middle of the stitch to be. You make your loop stitch toward the outside edge, and then you come back up in that middle point again and make another stitch, and you work your way around in a circle. And then when the first one's finished, I'll start a second one. And sometimes if things get a little crowded, you can't do a full circle, so I'll just do part of a circle. It's not a big deal. It will suggest that there are some of these berries that are partially hidden behind the other ones. And does it look realistic? Not really. I think these look more like flowers than berries, actually. But this doesn't have to be literal. It's just something to make me happy, and these colors make me happy. I like the way that they look with the other colors and shapes that are going on, and I'm enjoying the stitching, so I'm going to keep doing that and not worry about whether it looks like a real snowberry or not. That's not important. After I finished the first cluster, I've added a second, slightly smaller cluster because that sort of variety adds interest. And by not planning it out, I'm really mimicking what nature does so well. Things just grow and they look good without all that planning and hand-wringing and self-doubt. And after cutting out those snowberries, I had these little teeny tiny scraps of white cloth, and I thought, those little scraps would make really great highlights for the rose hips. The cloth that I chosen is quite dull and it doesn't really reflect light, but if you look at rose hips, they do reflect light. You can see those little tiny white specks on them. So I thought I would use those little scraps before I throw them out because there's really not a lot left there. I thought I would use them to make some tiny highlights on each of my rose hips. So I'm just going to cut out the teeniest tiny bit there. And I've still got the brown thread hanging around. So I'll just use that to sew on those tiny highlight bits. And it may seem strange to use these really messy stitches, but because the highlights are not actually there, it's just light, having the block of white cloth broken up with the dark lines across it actually suggests the highlights more than if I had just neatly stitched all the way around the outsides. And now for the last berry, I'm going to go on to the beauty berries. I just love these berries. They are my favorite. They're such an impossible purple color. And man, I just love this color. And they last pretty much all through the winter when there's so little color in the garden. They grow in these huge clumps. I had started out thinking that I would do this in a similar way that I did the snowberries. Cut out a piece of cloth in a blob shape and then add some French knots on top. And I thought this piece of cloth would be the perfect color for the background, but that's not what I ended up doing. And this is part of what I enjoy. I like making decisions as I go. I like changing my mind if I decide that that's not quite what I wanted to do. And what happened was I noticed that I had this little bit of wool yarn. It's knitting yarn. It's not even technically meant for embroidery, and it was the right color, and I had used it to make a little sweater for one of my cats here, and I thought, that's a good color. Let's see if I can use this to make some French knots. So it's quite thick. I had to use a huge needle to thread the yarn through the eye. And that seemed to work out all right. And then I noticed, I've got this fuchsia colored sparkly thread, and I can use that huge needle again to poke a large hole through the cloth so that the sparkly thread doesn't have as much friction, and this seems to be working out well too. And I do really enjoy the contrast between the sparkly metallic thread and the matte wool, and I'm gonna have to see if I can find any more of that wool, but I think I used it all up when I made that sweater. I did find this lovely, lovely silk thread in some really gorgeous colors. These silk threads and the sparkly threads were a gift from one of my lovely viewers. Thank you so much, Inga. I've really been enjoying finding ways to use these threads. They're somewhat similar to the 6-stranded embroidery cotton that you use, but they're made of silk, and they have far more than 6 strands. So I'm combining 2 or 3 colors of each of those strands and changing things around as I go to add more variety and depth so that it's just not one flat color. So I'm adding all kinds of little clusters of these berries here and there, just filling in spaces, overlapping some of my leaves and some of the other berries. So whatever is sitting on top pushes the other things into the background. And since I want the berries to be the focus of my piece, I don't mind if some of the leaves get covered up a little bit and are less prominent. They're still there, you can still see them. I'm not completely covering them up. I had been planning to use this brown pearl cotton to make some branches for my piece, but then I got distracted and I noticed some scraps that were still sitting on my desk from another project I've been working on. Does that make a perfect branch? So I can't not use it. So this is where my branch is going to go. Letting things emerge and letting things build and just getting inspired by what I have sitting around me. If I had rigidly planned this out from the beginning, I don't think that it would have gone in this direction, but I'm really glad that I felt like I could just change my plan and do something different, because I think it ended up being better than it would have if I had gone with my initial plan with the brown stems. I have this little scrap of cloth. It's so perfect to make an autumn leaf that I just have to use it, and the shape is right. Other than the French knots, there's really nothing complicated here. It's just sewing bits down. The stitches don't matter, they can be messy. The back is definitely messy, and I'm just not worried about it. I think there's a time and a place to try to be neat, and this doesn't have to be one of those. When you look at the plants growing out in nature, they are not neat and tidy. They are quite chaotic and messy, and that is the look that I'm going for. And I'm going to add a few more of the leaves. I don't want to cover up a lot of my berries, but I'll tuck them in wherever there's some blank space here and there. And that's how my piece looks now. It's going to be one of the pieces in the autumn themed collection that I've been working on. And in a previous video, I promised to explain to you what this whole ketchup thing is about. Well, it's something that one of my daughters said. And I promise you this is very cute. And don't react to the first thing I say here. Wait till you hear the punchline and you will smile, I'm sure. So, one of my daughters recently said, "I would hate to live in the United States and never have ketchup chips again." I hope you find it funny as well. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.